I'm Sara Shneiderman. I'm Assistant Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at Yale, and I work in Nepal, Himalayan parts of India, and also in the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. I've been going to the Himalayan region for nearly 20 years now. I went for the first time in 1994 as a college student, and I was studying anthropology and religious studies and was just fascinated by the diversity of cultural and religious practices and the way that they intermingled and the dynamic nature of social life in the region. I've been at Yale for nearly 2 years now, and I teach in anthropology as well as in South Asian studies. I've been involved in building up the South Asian Studies program here, particularly in my current role as Director of Undergraduate Studies for South Asian Studies. And I've also been involved with the Yale Himalaya Initiative since its inception. I've been serving as faculty coordinator and just doing playing a range of different roles to help bring speakers into campus and to really build up the profile of Himalayan studies at Yale. I first went to Nepal as a college student, as I mentioned, and I was very interested in studying religion, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. And as I began to become more interested in those topics and began to spend time in different parts of the country, living mostly in rural village areas, I started to understand that actually most people, and I would say that anecdotally, most people in Nepal actually have some sense of one of the other countries nearby, have either spent time themselves working or in education in India or perhaps China, particularly the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Many people spend time there for trade or other kinds of livelihood occupations. And so I became increasingly aware of the fact that even though looking from a kind of American or Western perspective, we often tend to think of the Himalayas as a remote and isolated location. Actually, many of the people who I was working with in these remarkable locations were in fact very cosmopolitan and were spending time traveling between multiple different countries, doing a whole range of different things. So I actually followed the people who I began working with in Nepal to their work sites, particularly in Himalayan parts of India, in Darjeeling and Sikkim, and also into the Tibetan Autonomous Region of China across the border to the north. And what I found was, as I was trying to understand livelihoods and ethnic identity for people who were living in rural Nepal, that it was absolutely impossible to understand what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing without also understanding something about the broader regional configuration and their own experiences of mobility across borders. Mobility across borders in the Himalayas is actually a very long-standing feature of livelihoods for many, many people. These days, we often tend to think of cross-border migration or mobility as a feature or a consequence of globalization. But I would suggest that actually for this part of the world, that's not the case at all. And in fact, many historical trade routes depended on mobility across what we would now see as nation-state borders, whether between Nepal and historical Tibet or between Nepal and India, also looking further east, for instance, between India and Burma, Burma and China, and then in the west, of course, between Nepal, India, Kashmir, Pakistan. I'm using the contemporary nation-state names, but the point is that historically many people have been very, very mobile across this broad region, and livelihoods have often depended on a combination of subsistence agriculture, which is of course necessarily rooted in one place, but that's complemented by different kinds of trade or wage labor, which in fact depend upon mobility. My doctoral research, which I'm now turning into a book, focuses on these processes of cross-border circular migration for one ethnic community called the Thangmi. And I look at how for the Thangmi cross-border circular migration is actually intimately tied up with processes of ethnic identity formation. So usually ethnicity is talked about within the framework of one nation state, or it's talked about as somehow being deterritorialized or transnational in this day and age. But I argue instead that actually the experience of being in different states and the different state policies that people encounter has significant effects on the way that they conceptualize and also enact and express ethnic identity and their very sense of themselves. It's been very important to me to maintain an open and continuous dialogue with the people with whhom I work, particularly members of the Tangmi community in relation to my doctoral work, and to make sure that what I'm writing about them actually reflects as accurately as possible what they think about themselves. Now, this is a challenging proposition because they don't all think the same things about themselves, and this is one of the large points that I try to make in my book, that just because people share an ethnic identity doesn't mean that they all think that ethnic identity is produced in the same way or is meaningful in the same way. So one of the big issues I have to deal with is a very diverse community, actually spread across several different countries, and with very different kinds of educational and class positions. So what you end up with is a situation in which certain people would like to control the types of things I write and ask me to write one thing instead of another. And my position has always been, well, I am actually trying to represent the community as a whole, and that requires sometimes having competing and contradictory voices in there. When we think about the Himalayas as a unit of analysis, I think what's really important is to, on the one hand, recognize the constituent nation states that make up the Himalayan region: India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Pakistan, probably others that I've missed out. So to recognize the specificity of those nation states, the kinds of policies that they apply, the effects that those have both on people and on the natural environment. But at the same time, to look at movement across those boundaries and to understand what connects them. So I think one of the most promising aspects of looking at the Himalayas as a focus of, as a new kind of area studies, is in fact to do both of those things at once.